Welcome to the deep dive.
Good to be diving in.
Today, we're tackling something, something we all deal with, making sense of the news landscape.
Right. It can feel like just this constant flood, can it?
Exactly. And who really has the time to wade through absolutely everything?
Nobody, basically.
So our goal here is to kind of pull out the crucial stuff, the key insights from the sources you sent over.
Yeah, looking at everything from, how news actually gets made to spotting when it feels a bit slanted.
We want to help you navigate it all without that feeling of being completely overwhelmed.
Think of it as maybe a toolkit for becoming a sharper news consumer.
Yeah, I like that.
We're not just, listing definitions. We're digging into the forces that shape what we see and hopefully offering some practical ways to make sense of it.
So the mission really is just to understand the news we're getting better.
That's it.
And we've got some really interesting material to work with. We'll be looking at how groups like Ad Fontes Media analyze sources.
And the critical thinking side of things, how to actually detect bias.
And also understanding how media ownership fits in, the whole world of propaganda and misinformation.
And even how our own habits online, like filter bubbles, shape what news finds us.
It's a pretty wide scope, but hopefully we can make it clear.
And when you look at it all together, you start seeing the patterns, right? How that ideal of, let's say, objective reporting kind of bumps up against the reality of deadlines and, well, just putting out the news every day.
Right. And how different kinds of leaning, whether they're intentional or not, creep in.
And most importantly, how you can become more informed, more confident about what you're reading or watching.
So by the end, you should have some solid takeaways, things you can use right away.
That's the plan.
Okay, let's dive in then. Right off the bat, sources like Ad Fontes Media and that Thinker's Guide, they hit on something really fundamental.
Which is?
That the whole idea of completely 100% unbiased news, it's maybe more of an aspiration, but not quite reality.
Yeah, that's a key point. Choices are always being made. What story gets covered? What angle do we take? What gets left out?
It's unavoidable, really.
Think about it, the sheer volume of stuff happening globally every single second.
It's immense.
And then consider what tiny percentage actually makes it into a news report. As the Thinker's Guide points out, there's this huge filtering process happening constantly.
Someone, somewhere, is making a judgment call. This is news. That isn't.
Exactly.
And the Thinker's Guide also kind of pushes back against some common myths, right? Like the idea that every news story comes from some lone reporter digging for weeks.
Or that there's always this crystal clear line between just reporting facts and giving an opinion.
Yeah.
And these myths, they can kind of obscure how the system actually functions. I mean, investigative journalism is vital, no question.
Of course.
But newsrooms also rely heavily on things like press releases, wire services, just to manage the flow.
Right, practicalities.
And that fact versus opinion line, it gets blurry. Because even just selecting which facts to highlight or how you frame them, that itself introduces a viewpoint. Subtly, maybe, but it's there.
And it's not always about someone deliberately trying to mislead, is it?
Not always, no.
The Thinker's Guide makes a really strong point about perspective. That example they use, the Arab editor and the Israeli editor, looking at the exact same event.
And seeing completely different stories. Yeah, that really hits home. Our backgrounds, our culture, they shape how we perceive things. Journalists aren't immune to that.
Makes sense?
Add in the daily grind deadlines, limited column inches or airtime, and you see why a perfectly objective, all-encompassing account is just, well, practically impossible.
Which leads us straight to that other source, detecting bias in the media. They just state it plainly. Media coverage is never completely objective.
So the big takeaway, even this early on,
You can't just rely on one source. You absolutely have to compare, see what different outlets are saying about the same thing.
precisely. No single newsroom has the whole picture. Seeing those different angles, different choices, that's how you build a richer understanding. It's foundational, really, for spotting the different types of leaning.
Okay, so let's get into those types. Detecting bias lays out quite a few. First up, bias by omission.
Just leaving stuff out.
Yeah, leaving out whole stories or certain perspectives within a story. It makes you wonder what kinds of stories don't usually make the cut.
Right. Are we mostly seeing the big conflicts, the famous people, the
It's
scandals.
sensational stuff.
Yeah. So a key thing here is realizing that the structure of news often favors the unusual, the exceptional.
Over the everyday.
Exactly. So knowing that, you can consciously look for information about, say, community projects or slow burn social trends that might get overlooked otherwise.
Good point. Then there's bias by emphasis,
Right.
where a story gets placed.
Front page versus page 10, lead story versus buried halfway through the broadcast.
That placement sends a really strong signal about what the outlet thinks is important, right?
Absolutely. And think about how consistently putting certain types of stories front and center can shape what you perceive as the biggest issues.
Yeah, it sets the agenda in a way.
What gets top billing day after day? What does that tell you about their priorities?
Then bias by use of language. This one's huge.
Oh, yeah.
Words matter.
The specific labels chosen can carry so much emotional weight. They give those examples. Terrorist, revolutionary, freedom fighter.
Same person, potentially.
Yeah.
But those words, they frame your reaction instantly. They tap into your existing feelings, your biases, before you even get the details.
And it's not just words, right? Bias can creep into the photos, too.
Definitely. An unflattering picture or cropping an image to change the context.
Visuals are powerful. They can sway you without you even realizing it sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bias in the source is another one, thinking about who is providing the information.
Right. Like if a drug company is the only source quoted in a story about its amazing new cure.
Reflect. Big time. And detecting bias points out that press releases, whether from businesses, government agencies, advocacy groups, they're often crafted specifically to persuade you.
So you always have to ask,
No.
who's telling this story? And what might their angle be? What's in it for them?
Critical questions.
Headlines, too. Oh, man, headlines can be so biased. Those clickbait titles.
Designed to grab you, not necessarily to reflect the story accurately.
And let's be honest, how many people only read the headline?
Way too many. So a sensational headline can create a completely false impression if that's all someone sees. Being a savvy reader means looking past that.
Then there's bias by repetition, hearing the same thing over and over.
It starts to feel true, or at least important, just through sheer repetition. It can normalize a viewpoint, even if it lacks solid evidence, creates a false sense of consensus.
And finally, bias in numbers and stats. You can make numbers say almost anything.
Oh, definitely. That death penalty example is perfect. Is it almost 30% support or over 70% oppose?
Same data, completely different feeling.
Exactly. It just highlights how crucial it is to look critically at how stats are presented. What's the context? What's not being shown? How are they interpreting these figures?
Okay, so that's a lot on bias types. Now, the Thinker's Guide adds a few more dimensions. One is national bias.
That sort of unconscious favoring of your own country's perspective, your own culture's narrative.
We all kind of do it, right?
It's natural, yeah.
Yeah.
We grew up immersed in it. The key is to be aware of it and actively seek out how others in other countries are seeing and reporting the same events.
Then there's sensitivity to advertisers, which, from a business angle.
Makes sense? News outlets need ad revenue to survive. So they might be, let's say, hesitant to publish stories that could really anger a major advertiser.
It's a tricky balance, journalistic integrity versus keeping the lights on.
It absolutely is.
And similarly, sensitivity to government and powerful interests.
Right. Rocking the boat too much with powerful institutions can sometimes impact access, getting interviews, getting information.
So there might be a reluctance to be overly critical, maybe.
It can happen, unfortunately. Maintaining those relationships can be seen as necessary, even if it subtly influences coverage.
And lastly, the Thinker's Guide mentions that bias towards novelty and sensationalism.
The if it bleeds, it leads principle.
Yeah. Dramatic, unusual events often get more play than slower, more common, but maybe equally important things.
It taps into our curiosity for the extraordinary, which is fine, but you need to remember it might not be giving you a representative picture of what's actually going on most of the time.
Wow. Okay, so adding all that up, it's clear there are so many forces shaping the news before it even gets to us.
Yeah. Which brings us neatly to the role of media ownership. That Journal of Nonlinear Analysis and Optimization had some interesting points here.
Right. They really emphasize how who owns the outlet can directly influence political reporting.
Whether it's individuals, big corporations, sometimes even governments, their control can really shape public opinion, intentionally or not.
How so?
Well, the journal talks about how owners can steer coverage through the stories they choose to run, the angles they push, just the general presentation. And that can have real impacts on things like elections, policy debates.
And connecting that to the bigger picture. We hear a lot about media consolidation, right? Fewer companies owning more outlets.
Exactly. And that concentration of ownership is a real concern when just a handful of powerful players control vast swaths of the media landscape.
It raises questions about the diversity of voices and perspectives we're actually getting access to.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about, like, the owner calling down and saying, run this story,
Yeah.
is it? The journal also mentions corporate interests, market pressures.
Yeah, market-oriented journalism. They need to attract an audience, often a specific demographic.
So they might tailor the coverage to appeal to that audience's existing views.
That can definitely happen, which can, unfortunately, contribute to a more polarized media environment where people are just hearing echoes of their own beliefs.
And ownership plays a huge role in gatekeeping too, right? Deciding what even gets through the gate to become news.
Definitely. And then agenda setting, how those stories are framed. Owners have significant influence over both. They shape what we talk about and how we talk about it.
Which must create a real tension sometimes.
Between what?
Between, journalistic autonomy, letting reporters follow the facts wherever they lead, and the influence of the owner's interests or political leanings.
A huge tension. And it can even lead to self-censorship.
How do you mean?
Well, journalists might, maybe consciously, maybe not, just avoid certain stories or angles because they suspect it wouldn't sit well with the ownership.
Wow. So, okay, the news isn't just reflecting reality. It's being actively shaped by editorial choices, by biases, by who owns the platform.
Right. Which leads us into maybe a more concerning area, propaganda and misinformation. Equal Justice USA had a really clear breakdown of this.
Yeah, they define propaganda as basically a systematic effort to spread biased or misleading stuff to manipulate public opinion.
And it's different from just, say, advertising a product. It's selling an idea, an ideology, often to gain or hold on to power.
They also made that useful distinction between different types of bad info, misinformation.
Which is wrong, but maybe unintentionally, just errors.
Right. Then disinformation.
That's the deliberate stuff, intentionally created and spread to deceive.
And malinformation, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's using real information, like a real quote or statistic, but twisting it or taking it out of context specifically to cause harm.
And because it has that grain of truth, it can be really tricky to spot.
Exactly. These distinctions matter because the intent and the potential harm are different.
And Equal Justice USA also pointed out how these tactics often play on existing narratives in society.
And can be especially harmful to marginalized groups. Propaganda often works by exploiting existing prejudices, creating scapegoats, reinforcing stereotypes.
They listed some specific techniques too, like the bandwagon strategy.
Making you feel like you're missing out if you don't agree. Everyone thinks this, so you should too. Plays on our social need to belong.
Then creating scapegoats. Pinning blame on a specific group to distract or build support for something else.
Yeah, demonizing the other, a sadly effective tactic throughout history.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, using scare tactics.
Fear overrides reason sometimes. Propagandists use it to cloud judgment, make people anxious, push them towards a certain conclusion.
And glittering generalities, those vague, feel-good phrases.
Like, make America great again, or build back better. They sound positive, appeal to emotion, but lack concrete meaning or policy detail.
It's kind of sobering realizing these tactics can be used by anyone, really.
Absolutely. It's not limited to one political side or ideology. Anyone with an agenda can employ them.
Which makes recognizing them so crucial.
That's the first line of defense, spotting the strategy in action.
Okay, so all of this is happening in our modern world, where algorithms are personalizing everything online. Which brings us to filter bubbles and confirmation bias. The Fake News LibGuide explained these well.
Yeah, filter bubbles. It's like the algorithm builds these invisible walls around you online, based on what you click, what you like, what you share.
It keeps feeding you more of the same.
Exactly. So you end up mostly seeing stuff that already aligns with your views. It creates an echo chamber.
And that limits your exposure to different perspectives, potentially challenging ideas.
Right. Personalization is convenient sometimes, sure, but it can also isolate you intellectually without you even noticing.
And then you layer on confirmation bias, that very human tendency we all have.
To favor information that confirms what we already believe.
Even if there's evidence pointing the other way.
And as the LibGuide notes, it's often unconscious. We just naturally gravitate towards stuff that validates our existing worldview, makes us feel comfortable.
Very well. Mine had those 4 examples, like not bothering to look for objective facts.
Or twisting information to fit your beliefs.
only remembering the details that support your side.
And just flat out ignoring evidence that challenges you.
It really shows how that bias works day to day, like a filter distorting reality.
Hmm.
And the LibGuide made the point that filter bubbles and confirmation bias work together, right? They create this feedback loop.
Exactly. They reinforce each other. The bubble limits what you see.
And the bias makes you more likely to accept what's inside the bubble and reject anything outside it.
Makes you much more vulnerable to misinformation, fake news, propaganda, all the stuff we've been talking about.
Okay, so given all these challenges, the built-in leaning in news production, ownership influence, propaganda, filter bubbles, our own biases, what can we actually do?
Right, the practical side. This is where critical thinking and building a balanced news diet come in. We got some great tips from Thinking Pro and Stand.
Thinking Pro really hammered home that critical thinking is the absolute core of news literacy.
Yeah, that ability to look at news, analyze it, evaluate it, understand what it's really saying and what it's not saying.
And people who get good at this, they develop real skills, like spotting bias more easily,
Actively seeking out different viewpoints.
understanding the how and why behind the news they see. That study they mentioned about media literate teens being more motivated, more skeptical, that's encouraging.
It really is. It shows it's not just about defense, like avoiding fake news. It's about becoming a more active, engaged citizen.
And Thinking Pro broke down the critical thinking skills needed, evaluating sources, evaluating evidence.
Looking at primary versus secondary sources, checking credentials, spotting potential bias in the source itself.
Analyzing the information too. How was it gathered? Sample sizes. Is it actually relevant?
And, of course, identifying and evaluating all those different types of media bias we discussed earlier.
And it's a two-way street, isn't it? Practicing news literacy actually sharpens your critical thinking overall.
Exactly. You get better at questioning assumptions, considering different angles, not just with news, but in general.
Okay, so theory's great, but what about practical steps? Stand had that really straightforward four-step approach to a balanced news diet.
Yeah, I liked that. Step 1. Pick just one or two trusted sources.
They suggested one national, one local.
Right. Keeps you informed without the overwhelm. And reduces exposure to potentially junky news.
Step 2, schedule specific news times, maybe 2 30-minute blocks.
And crucially, not first thing in the morning or last thing at night.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Protect your mood, protect your sleep.
It creates healthy boundaries, stops news from becoming this constant drip of anxiety.
Step 3, check in with yourself after reading the news.
Ask yourself, did I actually learn something useful? Does this directly impact me? How do I feel now compared to before?
It's like a little diagnostic test for your news habits.
Exactly. If you consistently feel worse afterwards or like you haven't gained anything valuable, maybe you need to cut back or change sources.
And step 4, redirect your attention. Intentionally shift to something engaging after your news time.
They even suggested making a list of enjoyable activities beforehand.
Smart. Helps you switch gears, stop dwelling on potentially stressful stuff, good for well-being.
Definitely.
The Thinker's Guide also had some great advice for becoming more critical, like actively seek out alternative perspectives.
Look at multiple outlets on the same story. Really trying to dig into the underlying viewpoints.
I like their suggestion to mentally rewrite a story from a different angle.
Yeah, that's a powerful exercise. Forces you to see other interpretations, spots the original bias.
They also said to see news as a blend of fact and interpretation, and to constantly evaluate it for, what was it? Clarity, accuracy, relevance, depth, breadth.
Significance, yeah. And noticing contradictions, hidden agendas, ignored facts, questionable assumptions, all signs of active critical reading.
And for tackling filter bubble specifically, the Fake News LibGuide mentioned tools like All Sides.
Which shows you stories from left, center, and right viewpoints side by side. Really useful for comparison.
And search engines like DuckDuckGo.
Right, which focus more on privacy and don't personalize results in the same way, helping you break out of that echo chamber.
So, wrapping this all up,
Yeah.
the big takeaway seems to be that being a smart news consumer isn't passive.
Not at all. It takes conscious effort. Awareness.
Awareness of all these factors, bias, ownership, propaganda, algorithms, our own psychology.
It's about constantly asking questions, comparing sources, considering different angles, being honest about our own biases.
Yeah. And thinking about how our online environment might be, narrowing our view without us realizing.
It really leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it?
Okay.
In this world just saturated with information, how can you proactively shape your news intake? not just to stay informed, but to actually build a deeper understanding, appreciate different views, and develop a more resilient sense of what's true.
That's a really good question. Something for everyone listening to maybe reflect on. How are my news habits serving me? Could I try some of these strategies?
Exactly. And as a practical next step, maybe check out some of those resources we mentioned. Ad Fontes Media, FAIR, Project Censored, All Sides, DuckDuckGo. They're all good places to start that ongoing journey toward becoming more media literate.
Definitely worth exploring.